What was life like in post-World War I London? Did the Roaring '20s resemble those in New York? And how does it all compare to life in London today? Keep watching to find out. But before we delve into it, make sure to subscribe to our History channel. In 1920, London was just recovering from the most devastating war it had seen. Its ongoing demands revolved around remembering and memorializing the dead, providing the physical and psychological needs for the traumatized living, and creating a narrative through which to understand what had just happened. Although Great Britain had emerged victorious from World War I, people were still anxious about it. Pervasive and insistent, war lived on in anxious discussions of what it meant to be British and modern, and in powerful images of the 1920s as a traumatized and unnerved world. But although Great Britain was working hard to overcome poverty, London was having none of it. Recovery went at a very fast pace, and for some, the conflicts turned out to be very profitable. Manufacturers and suppliers of goods needed throughout World War I had become very rich. These people, now part of the aristocracy or the upper class, opened jazz clubs and cocktail bars which flourished in the 1920s. The generation that lived like the Great Gatsby was too young to fight and had missed the horrors that their just slightly older generation had faced. Perhaps to escape from a sense of guilt, very rich Londoners partied like there was no tomorrow. The Roaring '20s in London was a partial emulation of those in the United States. Characters like F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, Prohibition, speakeasies, and Al Capone were all images that inspired life in London. The growing pace of global communications meant everyday life experienced the first process of Americanization. American corporations like Coca-Cola dominated British consumer culture. US films, music, and fashion were becoming increasingly popular. One of the most appealing aspects of the American dream was that anyone could have these symbols of glamour and happiness. A working-class British woman could own a Woolworth's dress and be as glorious as Theda Bara. But there were big changes to London life coming from within as well. In 1918, women over 30 had been given the right to vote. During the war, many women had been working in factories, earning a wage and, with it, some independence. By 1928, all women over 21 were allowed to vote. It may sound ridiculous today, but these baby steps were huge in terms of equal rights and modern mentality that is prevalent in London today. Women felt more confident and empowered, and this was soon reflected in their fashion style. The attractive, reckless, independent flapper appeared on the scene, shocking society with her wild behavior. Hair and dresses got shorter, and women could smoke, drink, and drive their own motor cars, completely disregarding Victorian expectations and embracing their freedom. Now, these changes weren't as apparent for women with children. Most of these were housewives. If they could afford it, they had a nanny too, but they still cooked all day long and changed into afternoon dresses after lunch to receive guests. In 1921, the Education Act raised the school leaving age to 14, and state primary education was now free for all children 5 or older. More education for children meant they would have better opportunities later on. This decision was economy-based as well. But the impression of ever-growing prosperity quickly faded. The reintroduction of the gold standard by Winston Churchill in 1925 kept interest rates high and meant UK exports were expensive. Coal reserves had been depleted, and now Britain was importing more coal than it was mining. The overall lack of investment in the British industry led to a period of depression and deflation. As the upper classes became more and more glamorous, the working class became poorer. By the mid-1920s, unemployment had risen to 2 million in the country. London saw many strikes during the 20s, including the 1921 coal miners' strike and the 1926 labor general strike, which ended with zero benefits for workers. Another big part of the 1920s culture in London revolved around Britain's global empire. The colonial era was over, but the empire was still there, studied at school, read about, and seen in movies or on the packets of tea. These recurrent images of the empire shaped the way Britons understood their nation's place in the world. However, it comes with a dark twist. The imperial idea of white superiority fueled racial tensions, destruction, and oppression of Black and Asian Britons. The 1920s in London were a mixed bag of glamour and poverty, hope and trauma, and some historians argue that we have chosen to edit out the nasty bits so that the roaring 20s would remain, well, roaring. Our obsession with glamour and hedonism distracts from equally compelling experiences of austerity, trauma, and conflict. All of these aside, on May 11th, 1922, something happened, and it would change the world forever. The first BBC radio broadcast.
2LO, Marconi House, London, calling.
Before Twitter, before Facebook, before the internet, before television, there was this piece of cutting-edge communications technology. The 2LO, the BBC's first ever radio transmitter, from which the very notion of public service broadcasting was born.
The rest is history. Although there had been a previous radio broadcast in Detroit in 1920, the BBC took commercial broadcasting to another level, making it a crucial part of British culture. People listening to the King's speech, news, and music. It was a fascinating technological marvel for all British families. In 1926, the BBC became a non-commercial organization, with governors appointed by the British government. Lord John Reith was a major figure in the development of the BBC. Working as its manager from its very beginning in 1922, Reith promoted a philosophy of public service broadcasting, focused on education and uplifting entertainment. BBC remains a pinnacle of UK culture today, producing culturally varied radio shows, films, and massively influential series such as all of David Attenborough's animal documentaries. Footage of a dynamic London was also recorded in the 1920s as part of a cinema travelogue series by Claude Friese-Greene, one of the pioneers of filmmaking. Fancy seeing London without seeing the tower. More than one American has offered to buy up our tower and erect it on Palm Beach as a bungalow. We met a beefeater off duty. They were having mutton for dinner that day. The film, restored by the BFI National Archive, shows simple scenes with quirky comments about life in London in the 20s. The BFI is now showing Friese-Greene's film alongside footage of London today. Over the last century, London has only gotten more roaring than the Roaring 20s. Oxford and Regent Streets are among the busiest streets in the whole world. The River Thames, once industrial, is now home to hundreds of super-modern buildings. London is one of the world's biggest, busiest, and most powerful cities. More than 300 languages are spoken in the capital, and London's population is almost 9 million, comprises over 13% of the UK population. World heritage sites and popular tourist attractions like Westminster Abbey, the Greenwich Observatory, and London Eye or Piccadilly Circus attract millions of tourists each year. Every year, new buildings appear in an ever-growing London. Renzo Piano's Shard became a popular attraction in the last 7 years. Its top-floor bar offers a stunning view of a city in constant development. 7 massive skyscrapers have cropped up in London only during the lockdown in 2020. Many of these buildings, such as 22 Bishopsgate, appear even bigger than they are in comparison to the old buildings neighboring them. London's skyline keeps growing, and the city's outskirts keep swallowing villages, connecting them to London's center through an immense underground network. Unlike in the 1920s, anyone can party in London today, no matter the socioeconomic class. There's a place for everyone, from lounges reminiscent of another time to Star Wars-themed bars. London is home to some of the most famous museums. The National Gallery, the British Museum, Tate Modern, and the Natural History Museum all showcase exhibitions central to British culture and life. And the never-sleeping West End theater scene is only matched by New York's Broadway. Theatre Royal on Drury Lane opened on May 1663, one of the oldest theatres in the world. Now there are 39 theatres in the West End, always creating productions more ambitious than the previous ones. In 2018, the Society of London Theatre announced a record year for the theatre industry with over 15 million attendances and box office revenues of almost £800 million. Much like New York City, London is a hub for multiculturalism, dreams and opportunities, growing a little or a lot each year. Would you have liked to live in the 1920s in London? What would be the best and worst parts about it? And what is your experience of contemporary London? Leave us a comment and let us know what other historical topics you'd like us to cover. And before you leave, don't forget to click the like and subscribe buttons.